when a lonely billionaire's simple question, "Can I hug you?" unlocks a world of unexpected friendship and hope. Everything he thought he knew about life changes forever. Richard Langston was a man everyone in the world seemed to know, yet no one truly knew him. His name was in magazines, on television, and even trending online most days. People admired his success. He was the founder of a giant tech company that changed how people communicated, shopped, and lived. By the time he turned 38, he had billions of dollars in the bank, luxury homes in 5 countries, and a private jet that could fly him anywhere in the world within hours. But even with all of this, Richard felt something missing deep inside, something he could not describe in words. He lived in a penthouse apartment on the top floor of a massive glass tower in Manhattan. It had views of the entire city tall, buildings, busy streets, lights that never slept. From up there, the world looked small, but inside the apartment it was quiet, almost too quiet. The walls were filled with expensive paintings. The furniture was perfect, and everything smelled of money. Yet it didn't feel like home. It felt like a showroom, empty. Richard's days were always full of meetings, phone calls, and decisions. Hundreds of people worked under him, and everyone respected him, or at least they acted like they did. His assistant was always polite. His driver never spoke unless spoken to. And his business partners only talked about profits and deals. No one asked how he was really doing. No one dared to. He had no wife, no children, and his parents had passed away a few years ago. He had siblings, but they were distant, too busy living their own lives. Over the years, Richard had dated many women, but none had stayed. Maybe it was the pressure of his success. Maybe it was because, deep down, Richard had built a wall around himself, afraid to let anyone truly get close. One night, after a long boardroom meeting that ended in arguments and tension, Richard returned home. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window watching the rain hit the glass. The city lights sparkled below like stars trapped on Earth, but instead of feeling powerful, he felt small. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that he was lonely. Not just lonely for company, but for warmth, for someone to care, someone to listen without wanting something in return. He left the drink untouched on the table, grabbed a hoodie from the closet, pulled the hood over his head, and left the apartment. He told no one, no driver, no assistant. He just wanted to walk. He took the elevator down alone and stepped out into the rainy night. The streets were slick with water, and people hurried by with umbrellas. Horns honked, lights blinked, and the sound of the city filled the air. Richard walked with no destination. He passed restaurants where couples laughed, families shared meals, and old friends caught up over coffee. Past stores, bus stops, and tiny bars. He watched people, ordinary people. No one recognized him, which was strange, but also nice. For once, he was invisible. After walking for over an hour, he found himself far from his usual part of the city. The buildings here were older, more broken down, streetlights flickered, and the sidewalks had cracks. He walked past an alley and heard a soft cough. Turning, he saw a man curled up under a cardboard box. A few feet ahead, an old woman was sitting on a crate, humming softly to herself. He kept walking, slower now. The faces around him changed. These weren't the rich or the famous. These were the forgotten ones. People who lived on the streets. Some were bundled in blankets. Some sat near fires burning in metal barrels. Some simply stared at the ground. Richard felt something twist inside him. He had seen photos of homelessness before, of course. He had even donated money to charities. But this, seeing it, breathing it, was different. It felt real. It felt painful. And for some reason, it felt connected to the emptiness inside him. He stopped at a street corner, unsure if he should turn back. That's when he heard a voice. "I think you need a hug. Can I hug you?" It was gentle, soft, and a little shaky. He turned to see an older woman standing just a few feet behind him. She wore a long coat that looked many years old. Her gray hair was tied back, her face lined with age and weather, but her eyes were kind. She smiled at him in a way that felt real, not the fake smiles he saw in meetings or in the media, but a smile that seemed to come from the heart. Richard was stunned. No one had spoken to him like that in years. No one had offered him a hug, especially not a stranger. He opened his mouth but said nothing. She took a step closer. "You look tired, sweetheart. Not tired in your body, but in your soul." Her words cut deep. He felt his eyes sting. He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, to say he was fine, but he couldn't. He just nodded. She opened her arms, waiting slowly, unsure of himself. Richard stepped forward and allowed her to embrace him. Her arms wrapped around him gently, like a grandmother holding her child. There's no pressure. No rush, just warmth. A simple human hug. And in that moment, something inside Richard cracked open. Felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest. Sadness, relief, confusion. Maybe even a little bit of hope. No one had hugged him like that since his mother died. No one had touched him without expectation, without pretending, without taking something in return. They stood there in silence for a moment longer before she let go. "You okay now?" she asked. Richard nodded, still unable to speak. She smiled. "Again, good. Sometimes all we need is to feel seen." He looked at her, really looked at her. "What's your name?" "Maggie," she said. "And you?" He hesitated. For a second, he thought about giving a fake name. But then he said softly, "Richard?" "Well, Richard," she said, "it's nice to meet you. Don't let the world harden your heart." He didn't know what to say, just stood there, watching as she turned and walked back to the small group sitting near the fire barrel. Richard stood on that corner for several minutes, replaying everything in his mind. That one hug had made more impact than all the awards, deals, and headlines in the last 10 years of his life. He slowly walked back to his apartment, but everything looked different now. The lights weren't as bright. The air felt heavier. Mind was spinning. That moment with Maggie had shaken something deep inside him. It felt like the beginning of something, though he didn't yet know what. Back in his apartment, he removed his hoodie and stared at himself in the mirror. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw a man. A lonely, tired man who had just been reminded of something important, what it meant to be human. That night, for the first time in years, Richard slept without pills. And in his dreams, he saw a street corner, a gentle smile, and arms wide open, waiting to give him a hug. The next morning, Richard woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't even fully risen, but something inside him felt different. The room looked the same, modern, quiet, and spotless, but his heart wasn't the same. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, remembering the night before. That moment, that hug, that soft voice that had spoken to his soul without judgment. Maggie, he couldn't forget her. All morning, his mind was not in his work. His assistant noticed he was quieter than usual. During meetings, he was distracted. When asked about investment plans, he simply nodded. Something inside him had shifted, and he knew it wasn't something he could ignore. He had met thousands of people in his life, investors, CEOs, celebrities, politicians, but never anyone like Maggie. She had nothing, yet she gave him something more valuable than anything he'd ever received: genuine human kindness. By afternoon, he couldn't sit still, grabbed his coat and told his assistant he was stepping out for a walk. "Alone," he added firmly. He didn't want the driver or anyone following him. This time, he remembered the exact path he had taken the night before. The street names, the broken buildings, the smell of rain mixed with city smoke. He retraced his steps one by one, unsure if he would find her again, but hoping he might. After nearly an hour of walking, he turned a corner and saw the same spot. The barrel with the fire, few people sitting around it, bundled in layers. His heart started to beat faster. He searched the group with his eyes, and there she was, Maggie, sitting on a wooden crate, holding a cup of something warm, her face calm, her eyes distant. Richard hesitated. Part of him felt awkward. Would she recognize him? Would she think he was strange for coming back? He walked slowly, his footsteps quiet. When he was just a few feet away, she looked up. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw him, and a smile spread across her face. "Well, if it isn't Richard," she said, as if she had been expecting him all along. He smiled, feeling the nerves in his stomach loosen. "Hi, I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "Of course I remember you. People don't just forget souls. They hug, she replied with a wink. Richard laughed softly. He hadn't laughed like that in a long time. Sat down on the edge of an old bench near her. It was cold, and the air was heavy with city dust, but he didn't mind. They sat in silence for a few moments. Then she handed him a paper cup filled with warm tea. Here, she said. It's not fancy, but it's hot. He took it with both hands and nodded in thanks. This is nice, he said. She looked around. This life ain't easy. But even here, we find little moments. You gotta find something to smile about, or it gets too dark. He took a sip of the tea. It was too sweet and too weak, but it warmed his hands, and strangely, it comforted him. Over the next hour, they talked. Not about money, business, or the stock market. They talked about life. Maggie told him she used to be a nurse. She'd worked in hospitals for over 20 years. I loved it, she said. Holding someone's hand when they were scared, helping them feel safe. That was my purpose. Then she lost everything. A fire broke out in her apartment building while she was at work. Her husband and son were inside. They didn't make it out. After that, everything changed. She couldn't work. She couldn't eat. She felt lost, like a piece of her had been ripped out and thrown away. She moved from place to place, trying to survive, trying to find something to live for. I didn't want pity, she said. I just wanted peace. And I found it, oddly enough, on these streets. The people who have nothing but still find ways to laugh. We take care of each other here. It's not much, but it's real. Richard listened quietly. Every word hit him like a soft punch to the chest. He realized that Maggie, though broken in many ways, had more emotional strength than most people he knew. She had found peace in places he never dared to look. He didn't tell her anything about his life. Not yet. He didn't want to break the moment. He wanted to keep this connection pure, without the weight of his name or his money. Over the next few weeks, Richard kept visiting Maggie. At first, it was once a week, then more often. He started bringing her sandwiches, coffee, sometimes extra blankets. She never asked for anything, never begged. She always thanked him with the same warm smile. They'd sit and talk for hours. About childhood, about dreams, about the funny things people say. Sometimes they sat in silence and just watched the world pass by. Maggie introduced him to others too. There was Earl, an old veteran who lost his leg in the war. There was Tanya, a single mother who ran away from abuse. There was David, who used to be a math teacher but now played harmonica for change. Each of them had a story. Each of them had once lived lives that sounded completely normal jobs. Homes, families, but one moment. One loss, one mistake, and everything had changed. And still, they were kind. They shared food when they barely had enough, helped each other, and didn't judge. Richard found himself looking forward to those visits more than anything else in his life. The boardrooms felt colder, his own home emptier. The people he worked with started to feel fake. He noticed how many of them smiled only when they wanted something. How no one ever said thank you without an agenda. With Maggie, things were simple. Pure. She made him feel like a person, not a product. One day, as they sat by the fire barrel, Maggie turned to him and asked, "Do you ever get lonely, Richard?" Paused. He had never admitted it out loud. Not to anyone. Yes, he said. All the time. She nodded like she had known all along. Loneliness is heavy, but it can be shared, like a blanket. It's not as cold when someone sits beside you. That night, Richard walked back home with her words in his head. He looked at his building tall, perfect, guarded. He entered the elevator alone, rode to the top floor, stepped into his grand empty apartment, and sighed. For the first time in his life, he didn't want to be there. He looked at his reflection again in the glass. He saw a man who had everything, but was starving for something money couldn't buy: connection. He began to think about what his life had become. Constant chase. Bigger deals, more power, higher numbers. But to what end? He had ignored the world below him for so long, had built towers to escape it. And now, one person, one woman sitting on a crate with a cup of cheap tea, had done more for his soul than all his millions combined. He didn't want it to stop. He wanted to keep seeing her, learning from her, giving back, not for charity points, not for headlines, but because it finally made him feel alive. The next morning, he canceled his meetings. When his assistant asked why, he just said, "I have something more important to do." And so, Richard Langston, the billionaire the world thought they knew, kept returning to that street corner, not as a hero, not as a savior, just as a man, sitting with another soul, drinking tea by the fire, finally learning what it meant to be human again. It had been over 2 months since Richard first met Maggie. In that time, his world had started to change slowly, piece by piece. At first, the change was invisible to others. But inside, something deep was moving. He no longer saw his days the way he used to. Before, life was a routine of business, meetings, and cold handshakes. Now, he looked forward to walking the streets, talking to Maggie and the others, hearing stories that opened his heart in ways he had never known before. He still hadn't told Maggie who he really was. To her, he was just Richard, a quiet man, with kind eyes who liked to listen more than talk. She never asked him what he did for a living. She never cared about what he wore or what car he had. In her world, none of that mattered. And Richard didn't want to break that magic. Being seen as just a man, not a billionaire, not a company founder, was something he had never experienced before. One chilly evening, Richard brought Maggie a thick woolen blanket. "I saw this in a shop and thought of you," he said, handing it to her. She touched the fabric and smiled. "This is warm. You think of others a lot, don't you?" "I didn't used to," he admitted. "I was too busy thinking of myself." "Well," she said, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, "you're different now." He sat beside her, watching people pass on the sidewalk. Across the street, a boy was playing with an empty soda can, kicking it like a soccer ball. A dog barked nearby. The wind blew gently, but it was sharp. Winter was arriving. Maggie looked at him and said, "You know, most people walk by without looking at us, like we're invisible, like we don't exist." Richard nodded slowly. "I used to be one of them, but not anymore." "No, not anymore." She reached out and patted his hand. "That's what healing feels like. When you stop walking past pain and start sitting with it." Richard was silent. Her words stayed in his heart. The next day, during a business lunch with some board members, one of them asked Richard a question about quarterly profits. But Richard didn't answer immediately. He was lost in thought, remembering the alley, the laughter around the fire barrel, and Maggie's gentle voice. When he finally spoke, his answer was short and didn't have his usual confidence. People noticed after the meeting. His assistant followed him to his office. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, concerned. "I'm fine," he said. He wasn't. He looked around his massive office, the tall windows, the polished floor, the glass table. It all felt cold, sterile, lifeless. He stood up and walked to the window. Down below, he saw people hurrying to lunch, traffic jams, flashing lights, a city full of noise, but somehow still full of silence. That evening, Richard returned to the streets, but Maggie wasn't there. He waited. He walked around the block, asked a man with a shopping cart if he'd seen her. The man shook his head. Richard's chest felt tight. He returned the next day. Still no sign. He visited for 3 days straight, but Maggie was gone. Panic slowly started to rise inside him. Had something happened? Was she hurt? Had she moved? Finally, on the 4th day, a familiar face, David, the man with the harmonic, recognized Richard and waved him over. "She's in the shelter on 14th, he said. "Her chest got bad, breathing trouble. They took her in 2 nights ago." "Is she okay?" "She was coughing real bad. They said she'd be fine. You should go. She likes seeing you." Richard thanked him and immediately left. Walked to the shelter himself. It wasn't a fancy building. It looked old and a little broken. But inside, it was warm. People rested on narrow beds, Volunteers served soup, and nurses moved between patients with care. Richard asked about Maggie, and a kind nurse led him to a corner where she was resting. Maggie was lying on a thin mattress, covered in a blanket. Her face pale, but peaceful. Her eyes opened slowly when she saw him. "Well, look who came walking in like a worried puppy," she said with a weak smile. He kneeled beside her bed. "I was scared," he said honestly. She reached out and held his hand. "It's just a chest cold. Happens every winter. I'll be all right." He stayed with her for hours, brought her fruit and crackers, told her stories about the silly things he'd seen in the city. They laughed, even though she kept coughing. Then she looked at him seriously. "You care for me more than most people ever have?" He swallowed hard. "You've done more for me than anyone else ever has." She studied his face. "There's something about you, Richard. You carry weight, not the kind you see on a scale. The kind that comes from living two lives. One for the world, one for yourself." He looked down. "I've been lying to you." She didn't flinch. "What kind of lie?" "I didn't tell you who I am, what I do." "All right," she said. "Tell me now." "I'm the CEO of Langston Tech." She blinked. "Oh my." "So that's why you smell like expensive cologne." He smiled nervously. "I didn't want you to treat me differently." "I won't," she said. "You're just Richard to me. The man who brought me tea and listened without judging." His eyes filled with tears. He had been so afraid of this moment, afraid it would change things. But it didn't. Maggie was. Still Maggie. After that day, things changed again. Richard began visiting the shelter regularly. Not just for Maggie, but for others too. Spoke with the staff, asked what they needed. Blankets, medicine, better food. He went home and made a decision that shocked everyone in his company. He called a meeting with his board. "I want to start a new project," he said. "We'll build shelters, real ones, with good beds, doctors, food, and hope. Across the country." The room went quiet. One executive asked, "Sir, is this about image, public relations?" Richard replied, "No. It's about purpose." Another board member warned, "This could affect profits." Richard nodded. "I don't care." That was the beginning of something huge. He named the project Haven, used millions of his own money to fund it. The first shelter was built. In the very area where he met Maggie. It had soft lighting, warm colors, real beds, clean bathrooms, and counselors. It was designed not just to protect, but to uplift. Maggie was moved there when it opened. She had her own room. Her health improved quickly. She started helping around, talking to others, comforting those who arrived broken and scared. Richard visited often, sometimes in a suit, sometimes in jeans. No one cared. He wasn't a CEO there. It was just Richard. Maggie would often joke, "Imagine this. A billionaire sitting cross-legged on the floor, peeling apples with a homeless grandma." He'd laugh and reply, "It's the best part of my week." One day, while sitting beside her, she said, "You found what you were missing, didn't you?" He nodded. "I thought I had everything, but I had nothing. Now I have something real." Maggie looked into his eyes. "You have people now. You have love. That's the richest thing of all." He reached out and held her hand again, just like the first night she hugged him. In the weeks that followed, more shelters were built. More lives were touched. Richard's company did take a small financial hit, but something incredible happened. People around the world began to notice not just the shelters, but the honesty, the heart. His story spread not as a business move, but as a human story. And at the center of it all was a woman who once sat on a crate in the cold and offered a hug to a stranger who looked lost. Now she was living proof that one small act of kindness can change the direction of someone's entire life. Richard often told her, "You gave me a hug when no one else saw me." That hug was the beginning of everything. She would smile, squeeze his hand, and say, "You just needed to be reminded that you're still human." After the success of the first shelter, Richard's life took on a new meaning. Before, his days were ruled by deadlines, profits, and endless meetings. But now he was driven by a mission much bigger than any business deal, Project Haven. was growing, and with it, Richard was discovering parts of himself he didn't even know existed. Building shelters wasn't easy. There were many challenges. Some people didn't believe in Richard's vision. They said he was wasting his fortune, that this was just a temporary feeling of generosity. Others whispered that it was a PR stunt, a way to make himself look good in the media. But Richard didn't listen to the noise. He had seen real people, their faces, their struggles, their hope, and that was enough. He started traveling to different cities, visiting areas where homelessness was most severe. He met people from all walks of life, hearing stories that broke his heart but also filled him with determination. He saw veterans who had given everything for their country but had nowhere to live. Mothers who worked 2 jobs but still couldn't afford a roof over their children's heads. Young people lost to addiction and despair. Every story was a reminder of how fragile life can be and how easy it is to fall through the cracks. It was also a lesson in resilience, in the strength of the human spirit. Richard found himself learning from these people, not teaching them. In every new shelter, he made sure to include things that mattered most: safe spaces for children to play, quiet rooms for people to rest, counseling services, job training programs, and even art and music workshops. He wanted the shelters to be more than just a place to sleep. He wanted them to be places where people could rebuild their lives and find hope. Back at his company, the board was still skeptical. The profits had dipped, and some executives worried about the future. But Richard stood firm. People come first, he said. If we build a better world, profits will follow. Slowly, the public began to notice. Newspapers and TV stations covered the story, not just about the billionaire's money, but about his heart. Richard gave interviews, but he always made sure to highlight the people he met, the stories he heard, and the lessons he learned. He credited Maggie and the community she belonged to for changing his life. Maggie, too, had changed. She was no longer the quiet woman sitting by the fire barrel. She was a leader in the shelter, helping others find their footing, sharing her wisdom, and offering the same kindness that had once saved Richard. Her health improved, and she found joy in giving back. One afternoon, Richard visited the shelter in a small town far from the city. The place was bustling with life children, laughing, adults chatting, volunteers busy at work. As he walked through the rooms, a young woman approached him. "Are you Mr. Langston?" she asked shyly. "Yes," he replied, smiling. "My name is Sarah. I've been coming here for 3 months now. You don't know how much this place has changed my life. I was homeless, addicted, and hopeless. But here, I found help, friends, and a future." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. You inspire me." She smiled. "You inspired me first by believing in people like me." Richard spent the afternoon talking to many residents. Each one had a story of pain and hope, loss and recovery. It was a reminder that behind every number in his reports were real lives, real dreams. But with success came new challenges. Its communities resisted the shelters, fearing they would bring trouble or lower property values. Richard faced protests and harsh criticism. He understood the fears, but also knew that change was never easy. He worked hard to build bridges with local leaders, educating them about the shelter's benefits. He invited neighbors to visit, to see the programs in action, and meet the people whose lives were being transformed. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. Meanwhile, Richard's personal life was opening in unexpected ways. The connection with Maggie deepened. They shared quiet moments, laughter, and even dreams. Richard found himself wanting to protect her, to make her happy beyond what money could buy. One evening, as they sat outside the shelter watching the stars, Maggie said softly, "You've given so much to others, Richard, but what about yourself? What do you want?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. "I don't know, I think. I want to keep making a difference. I want to live a life that matters." She smiled. "That's a good start, but don't forget to live for yourself, too." He took her hand gently. "I'm learning." Friendship blossomed into something more. But it was never rushed or forced. It grew naturally, built on trust, understanding, and the simple joy of being together. Richard also reconnected with his family. For years, his relationship with them had been distant, strained by his focus on work. But now, with new purpose, he reached out. Slowly, they began to heal old wounds, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. The media loved this part of the story, a billionaire who found meaning and love in the unlikeliest places. But Richard was careful not to let fame distract him. His heart was still with the people who had welcomed him when he was lost. One day, a major crisis struck. A nearby city was hit by a severe storm. Floods destroyed homes, leaving hundreds homeless overnight. Richard immediately organized relief efforts. Haven shelters opened their doors to evacuees. Volunteers worked around the clock. Funds were raised, supplies sent. Richard was on the ground, coordinating efforts, comforting families, ensuring help reached everyone in need. It was the most challenging time yet, but also the most rewarding. In the weeks that followed, the community came together stronger than ever. People who once felt forgotten found support and hope. Richard saw the true power of compassion and unity. Through it all, Maggie stood by his side. Her strength and courage inspired him daily. Reflecting on his journey, Richard realized how far he had come. From a lonely billionaire searching for meaning to a man whose life was filled with purpose, love, and connection. He knew challenges would come. But he also knew he was not alone. Together with Maggie and the community he was building, more than shelters, he was building a future where no one would feel invisible or unloved, and that future was worth every sacrifice. After months and years of hard work, the Project Haven had grown beyond what anyone imagined. What started as a single shelter in a small neighborhood had turned into a nationwide movement. Cities from coast to coast were building shelters. Inspired by Richard's vision, places filled with hope, care, and dignity. Richard, once a businessman focused solely on profit, had transformed into a leader who inspired millions. But the journey was not without its struggles. Every step forward came with obstacles. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when Richard doubted himself and wondered if all the sacrifices were worth it. Could a billionaire really change the system? Could one person truly make a difference in a world so full of pain? Despite these questions, Richard kept moving forward, driven by the people he had met, the veterans, the mothers, the young people, and especially Maggie. She had become his anchor, his friend, and his partner in this incredible journey. One chilly morning, Richard visited one of the newest shelters in a small town that had been struggling with homelessness for years. The shelter was buzzing with activity. Volunteers were preparing breakfast. Children were getting ready for school, and adults were attending workshops. The atmosphere was warm and alive. As Richard walked through the rooms, he spotted Maggie sitting with a group of women. She was listening carefully as they shared their stories. Her eyes were full of compassion and understanding. Seeing her like this made Richard feel a deep sense of gratitude. Later, Maggie approached him with a smile. "Come see this," she said, leading him to a small room where a young man was painting. Richard looked at the canvas. It was a beautiful portrait of a sunrise, full of bright colors and hope. "That's James," Maggie said. "Here for 6 months. When he arrived, he was broken. No family, no job, no home. What painting helped him heal. Now he's planning to open his own art studio someday." Richard nodded, touched by the story. "That's why we do this." Days passed quickly. Richard spent most of his time visiting shelters, meeting residents, and planning new programs. But he also took time to reflect on how much he had changed. He remembered the night he met Maggie, the moment she hugged him when he was feeling lost and invisible. That hug had been the beginning of everything. It had opened his heart and showed him a new way of living. In his board meetings, Richard was no longer the man who talked only about numbers and profits. He spoke about people, community, and responsibility. Some executives had left the company unhappy with the new direction, but many stayed, inspired by his passion. One day, a reporter asked Richard in an interview, "What has been the most important lesson you've learned through this journey?" Richard smiled thoughtfully. "That kindness is powerful. That every person deserves to be seen, heard, and loved. And that sometimes the smallest act, a hug, a smile, A listening ear can change a life. He paused. I also learned that success is not measured by money or status, but by the impact we have on others. Maggie was always nearby, supporting him quietly. Their relationship had grown deeper, built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. They didn't rush things. Instead, they enjoyed every moment together, the laughter, the talks, the simple joy of being present. One evening, as they sat together watching the city lights, Maggie said, "You know, Richard, you came to the streets, looking for something you couldn't find in your skyscrapers. And now you've become part of a family you never knew you needed." Richard took her hand gently. "You've saved me in ways I can't even explain," she smiled softly. "Sometimes we all just need a hug." The movement grew stronger. Other billionaires and business leaders began to take notice. Some reached out, offering support and partnerships. Richard welcomed this, but he always kept the focus on people, not profits. He worked with local governments to create policies that helped homeless people find housing, jobs, and healthcare. He pushed for changes in how society viewed homelessness, as a problem to ignore, but as a challenge to solve together. At one point, a documentary crew followed Richard and Maggie for several months, capturing the story of Haven. The film showed the struggles, the triumphs, and the everyday moments. That made the project real. When it aired, millions of people watched and were inspired to help in their own communities. Richard received letters and messages from people all over the world, thanking him for showing that even the richest person could be humble, kind, and compassionate. But despite the public praise, Richard remained grounded. He knew the real heroes were the people living in the shelters, the ones fighting every day to rebuild their lives. He often visited the shelter where it all began, quietly with Maggie by the fire barrel. They would talk about their dreams, the future, and the importance of never forgetting where they started. One cold winter night, Richard surprised Maggie with a small gift, a simple necklace with a tiny heart pendant. "It's for you," he said, "to remind you that you changed my heart." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, "And you changed mine." Their bond was unbreakable. Looking back, Richard realized that the hug he received that first night was more than just comfort. It was a turning point, a moment that reminded him that behind all the wealth and success, he was still human, vulnerable, in need of love and connection. That realization changed everything. The story of the billionaire who needed a hug became a symbol of hope for many. It showed that no matter how much money or power someone has, true happiness comes from kindness, compassion, and genuine human connection. Richard's life was no longer about chasing success alone. It was about building a legacy of love and care that would last far beyond his own time. He often said, "We all need a hug sometimes. When we give one, we give a little piece of hope." The journey that started with one simple question, "Can I hug you?" had grown into a movement that touched thousands of lives and changed the way people saw each other. And in that, Richard found his greatest success.